From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, let's also talk about the raft of individual polls that have come in. And now we're within a week of Election Day, and it seems like every day there are lots and lots, dozens sometimes, of polls that are being released. What are the ones that are sticking out to you from recent days?
Well, before I get into some specific ones, just a broad note. I have found this interesting. The last election cycles, we've seen the same thing happen, which is that a lot of mainstream polling firms, they will lean very heavy on Democratic assumptions much of the cycle. And then toward the last week, they'll start landing polls that show races much tighter or sometimes Republicans ahead. This is one of the reasons their excuses for when the polling averages are off at the end of the day. And we've had a lot of discussion about that, is they'll say, yeah, well, the averages are off. But if you look at our last poll, it was really close. And we're seeing some of that happen here now. A Fox poll that came in looking at Wisconsin, it has Senator Ron Johnson up 2. It has Tim Michels, who's running to be governor, up 1 against sitting Governor Tony Evers. Also, the Fox poll had Arizona, Mark Kelly in Arizona, up by just 1 over Blake Masters, which is within the margin of error. Morning Call had the Pennsylvania Oz Fetterman Senate race tied. Susquehanna has Adam Laxalt out in Nevada, who is running against sitting Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, up 5 points. And then here's one. Republicans have been focusing very much on New Hampshire for a long time. They thought that was out of reach. They've got a little bit more of a controversial nominee, Don Bolduc. But St. Anselm has a poll out now, having Bolduc up 1 over Senator Maggie Hassan. And also the first district there in New Hampshire, Carolyn Levitt, who is a very young Republican, they have her beating Chris Pappas, who's the representative there, by 6 points. So we're seeing some of these changes come along, and things look to be either tightening or polls are showing some advantage for GOP in most of the states that matter to them.
A couple points that I would make about the polling. One is that, of course, as we've discussed, we don't know how much the polls are off. And there have been indications that fewer people than ever are picking up the phone and going through with the pollster and answering all the questions and doing completed interviews. And so I will be curious to see the day after the election how much the errors are, who was right, who was wrong, and whether it seems like this whole tracking the polls so closely operation that a lot of political journalists do seems like it is going to be working in elections to come. The other point that I would make is that polling averages are often looked at because one poll might be skewed for a reason or another, but if you average a bunch of different polls by a bunch of different polling outfits together, you can maybe get closer to the truth, is the theory behind that. But one thing about that is that it means that if there's a change, the polling average will lag the change. So just to pick an example that Kim used, the Wisconsin governor's race, the last 2 polls both show Tim Michels up by 1 point over Governor Tony Evers, but Evers is still winning in average because there were previous polls that showed him up by 2 and by 1 and by a tie. And so there's 5 polls that are going into that Real Clear Politics average. And so it can be tricky trying to figure out at what point the change is happening and when you should no longer look at the average because those older polls are skewing it and it's no longer reflecting what's happening on the ground now. The other point I would make about New Hampshire, Kim, and I think this is an interesting one, is this is one of those races where Democrats meddled in the Republican primary because they thought Don Bolduc would be an easier candidate to beat. He had made controversial statements. He had all sorts of things that you could imagine in campaign attack ads. And by the way, they may be right about that. The other Republican running was more moderate. He was more centrist. He was a state legislator, and he may have been a stronger candidate. And so he may have outrun Bolduc here if you can do a counterfactual. But what's interesting is we may be seeing, Kim, now a red wave that is strong enough to even take somebody like Don Bolduc and get him into the United States Senate, in which case I think there may be times over the next 6 years when Republicans and moderate Democrats and even progressive Democrats will see things that Don Bolduc says if they or see votes that he makes, and they can point to the Democrats who meddled in that Republican primary and say that they helped bring about that election.
Well, it'll be a learning lesson for one side or the other. We'll see what comes out of it. This was, at least in my time covering politics, a pretty new phenomenon. It may have happened at times in the past more quietly, but the naked way in which Democrats did this, running ads that were designed to promote the candidate that they felt would be most easily beatable, was pretty out there and just stark. They didn't try to hide it at all. And it wasn't just in New Hampshire. They did it in a couple of other states and districts as well, too. And some of us noted at the time, be careful what you're wishing for here, because if the dynamics are what the polling was suggesting, even at that time, there was always a possibility that there was going to be a momentum in favor of Republicans and that this could be the outcome. One other thing I just want to point out, too, about polling, because I think it helps explain why it's been particularly confusing this year and why you continue to see some outlier polls, which is turnout. If you really look at these polling models, yeah, some of it is how many people you can get on the phone. That dictates the quality of your polls. The more people, usually the better. Another aspect of it is what's the makeup of the people you call? Are they representative of the people who are likely to show up at the polls? But a big one is turnout. And you stack that into your polling model and you say, well, we talked to this many Republicans, this many Democrats, but our information suggests to us that more Democrats are going to turn out than Republicans, or more Republicans are going to turn out than Democrats. And you weight all that in your poll. Nobody knows what they're doing this year because of 2020. There's a lot of really interesting stats right now coming in about very high voter turnout. And a lot of people noting, for instance, that a lot of those who are making up that early number are Democrats. Then again, after 2020, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Republicans really soured on early voting. They feel it's not as safe as showing up in person. So how big is that number going to be on the day? Likewise, did the many Democrats who utilized early voting last time, are they all still using it again? Or how many of them are going to show up on the day? One more little fact, young voters so far are really not taking part in early voting when they did last time. Does that mean that a key portion of the Democrats' voting bloc is sitting at home this time? Or are they going to show up on voting day? So there's a lot of confusion on this. I think it's why you end up with some really wild results that we're seeing right now. One example, in New York, a recent Emerson poll said that Kathy Hochul, the governor, is ahead by 9 over Lee Zeldin, the Republican competitor. But Trafalgar, which is a more conservative polling group, but has had some pretty good results in the past, says that race is tied. Now, both of those can't be true, but it's going to be a really interesting judgment come election day on some of these polling methods and the assumptions that went into them.
The other issue that I think is worth watching is if we have very close races, this divide between who votes early and particularly by mail, this partisan divide may come into play. And I would point to a recent ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court telling counties to set aside mail ballots that voters did not handwrite the date on. And there's been a long-running dispute over whether those ballots are supposed to be counted. State law says that voters are supposed to, quote, fill out, date, and sign, unquote, the ballot. But there's been some state cases about this. There's been some federal cases about this. There was a justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court who died a couple months ago, and so we ended up with a 3-3 split in this case, and so they have not ruled on that question for good. But they are ordering counties for now to set those ballots aside. And what's notable about this is the Associated Press has a story on this, and it says that in 2020, Philadelphia reported about 380,000 mail ballots, and of those, about 8,000 of them did not have dates on them. And this is a huge problem, I think, because if the Senate race between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz ends up being very close, it could be a few thousand ballots that are separating those two candidates. And you could end up with a big stack statewide of thousands and thousands of votes that don't have dates on them. And it's going to go to court. And you're going to end up having a judge have to decide whether those ballots are valid or not. And most of those ballots, by the way, look like they will be coming from Democrats. According to some statistics at the U.S. Elections Project, about 71% of the mail ballots that have been sent in so far in Pennsylvania are coming from people who are registered as Democrats. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they voted entirely for Democratic candidates, but it does suggest that there is a partisan split on this issue of undated ballots. And this is one more reason that I think state legislators ought to go back after this election. They should have done it after 2020, but look at these laws and try to figure out ways to make sure that we have clear, agreed upon rules before Election Day. So we don't have this situation where after the facts are all known, after everybody knows that it's the 50-50 Senate, let's say, and this is going to be the deciding factor, then all of the pressure will be on the judiciary to make the decision. And that is a terrible position to put a judge in. Kim, we'll give you the last word.
Well, making this Pennsylvania case even more intriguing is the dynamic around it, too. As you noted, the Chief Justice passed away. There are now 6 members on the court. This was a 3-3 ruling. Only, though, interestingly, because one of the Democrats on the court moved over with the 2 Republicans. And the only thing that they could agree on was that for now, these votes were going to be set aside. They're not going to be counted now. They could not agree on what should happen in the future. And they're deadlocked on that. So then the question becomes, can Tom Wolf, the governor of the state, it's his prerogative to name a replacement justice. Guess who runs the Senate in the Pennsylvania legislature? Republicans. So he could come out with a new nominee. Would they agree to his nominee? Most likely not. Could there be a nominee that all sides agreed to and decided to fast track to the court? Maybe. But then the amount of pressure on that justice coming in to make a decision on this, again, to your point, Kyle, this is the intersection of a lot of very messy tangents. And it's the kind of thing, to go all the way back to your original point, we want voters to feel confidence in the system as it's set. Not that there are after the fact rulings that swing a race one way or the other. And I'm very worried at the moment, especially given the importance of Pennsylvania to the control of the U.S. Senate and its Senate race. This could become the flashpoint of this year's election.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.